Ladies and gentlemen, welcome very much to this JustShare webinar on China, and it's basically when China, trade and human rights collide. Really great fun to have you all here. My name is Richard Burge, and I'm the Chief Executive of the London Chamber of Commerce and Industry. And my office is literally, I'm in this office. I have to introduce you to this new concept. This is called an office, and it's where people in olden days used to come and work. Some of you may remember those days. Anyway, welcome to the London Chamber of Commerce and Industry. And we are literally just down the road from St Mary le Bow Church, who of course is the home of JustShare. And it's really a great pleasure for me personally to chair this event, but also for the London Chamber of Commerce and Industry to be supporting a number of JustShare events this year. So we are going to start with a panel discussion. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to have about 8 minutes talking to us each, and then we'll have a Q&A, and I'd ask you to put the Q&A in the chat box. So the most important thing is when you think of a question or when you think of a comment, put it in the chat box straight away. Don't wait until the end, because you will guarantee to have forgotten what you wanted to say by that point. So put it in straight away, and I'll come back to the chat box, and I might ask a couple of you to actually articulate your question, but most of the time I'll just feed it to the panel and get them to engage with it. So thank you all very much indeed for joining us at this event. A few declarations of interest. So first of all, just so you know, my background does involve China. I was born in Hong Kong. I spent the first 5 years of my life there, and frequently mostly for work, but also a little bit for pleasure. I've been back and forth there for the past 60 years. So that's my declaration of interest over. For us at the London Chamber of Commerce, the reason we've got involved in JustShare is two reasons. One is we think JustShare reminds us all in the commercial world here in the heart of the City of London that there are some important issues we cannot ignore and cannot let go away. And the second thing is we're very impressed and very pleased about the fact that JustShare doesn't just engage in the simple problems, it engages in what I would call wicked problems. And these are problems where there is no clear solution, and where actually the way ahead might be a pathway which is not ideal, but at least is a pathway towards a solution, even if it doesn't offer one straight away. So, and I think actually this whole issue of China, trading with it, the fact that it is now arguably the largest, if not second largest economy in the world, and yet there are serious concerns about its human rights record and human rights activity. This is a wicked problem, and it will not go away simply by trying to ignore it or simply wishing it wasn't there. We've got to address it, and we've got to discuss it, and by that I mean we've got to engage with the issue and respect each other's judgments and views on it, and try and learn from that dialogue. So having a panel discussion on this is very important. I'm really pleased we've been joined by 5 people who know what they're talking about here. So we have Matthew Turner, who's the chair and chief executive of the Labour Campaign for Human Rights. Matthew is a practicing barrister, and he is also on the advisory board of the World Uyghur Congress. Really pleased that we're joined by Sir Vince Cable, who is an expert on China. And of course, we all remember Vince from not that long ago. He was the Secretary of State for Trade and President of the Board of Trade in the coalition government. We have Nairola Elmer, who is a supply chain analyst and human rights researcher from Sweden. And then David Schilling. And I'm not sure whether David's joined us yet. I hope he has. David is the Senior Programme Director of the Interfaith Centre for Corporate Responsibility. Again, a huge thinker about these issues. So I think we've got a really interesting panel here who are not going to, on one hand, let us think this is simple, and on the other hand, they're going to get us to engage in the real issues. So we're going to start with each one saying a few words to us, and we're going to start with Matthew. Matthew, over to you.
The level of human rights abuses that we're seeing have, in my view, and in the view of more and more legal commentators and experts, been elevated to the level of genocide. And I mean that in the legal sense of the word. But I don't think that's needs to be the focus of the discussion here today with this audience. And what I want to focus more on is a particular aspect of the human rights abuses happening in China, and that's the forced labor element, because that relates most directly to corporate supply chains and the kind of businesses that are based in the UK and operate from the City of London. Now, let me start with a short story from history. In 1862, in the middle of the US Civil War, Abraham Lincoln sent ships to blockade the export of cotton from the southern states to England. And this actually had a devastating impact on the Lancashire textile industry at the time. And many hundreds and thousands of mill workers in those towns faced starvation and destitution. And yet, at that time, on the 31st of December, 1862, cotton workers got together in Manchester and they met at the Free Trade Hall, and they unequivocally declared their support for the Union in its fight against slavery in America. And it was an extraordinary act of solidarity because these workers had no personal connections to the slaves in the American South at the time, but they believed in human dignity. And they took a stand, and they did so despite the personal economic cost to themselves. And now I start with this example because it shows that British workers have a proud history of opposing slavery. And here we are, 150 years later, in the 21st century, where slaves are picking cotton in a different part of the world. And the question really is, what are we going to do about it? As I've mentioned, forced labor is a key feature of what's happening in China to the Uyghur people in Xinjiang and elsewhere. And this really came to the fore at the start of last year when the Australian Strategic Policy Institute published an explosive report called Uighurs for Sale, in which this think tank was exploring what was happening to the millions of Uyghurs that were disappearing into re-education camps. And they found, they revealed that there was evidence based on the documents they looked at and translated of a labor transfer scheme where people were being taken from Xinjiang and transferred to factories all around China. And they estimated that between 2017 and 2019, approximately 80,000 Uyghurs were transferred out of Xinjiang to factories all around China in what's been described as it's called officially the Xinjiang Aid Program. What was so explosive about this report, though, was that 82 or so major international brands like Amazon, Apple, Google, H&M, Nike, and Zara were found to be directly or indirectly benefiting from forced Uyghur labor outside of Xinjiang. That's the labor transfer scheme, but what about within Xinjiang itself? Well, I've already mentioned the cotton industry, and the BBC did an incredible piece towards the end of last year called "China's Tainted Cotton." You can Google it and have a look on the BBC website. It's a great interactive feature. But what it showed was satellite images of various different locations in Xinjiang, where first of all construction sites appeared, then these re-education camps, i.e. prisons, with watchtowers and tall walls appeared. And then, this is the critical bit, outside of these prisons, factories were built, all shown in this satellite imagery. And then even there are images of workers moving from the prisons to the factories, all wearing the same colored uniform. It's it is reminiscent of what we saw 70 years or so ago during the Holocaust. And the real problem here is that, and the reason why the piece is called China's Tainted Cotton, is because 84% of Chinese cotton comes from Xinjiang, and that amounts to 20% of the global production of cotton. So the upshot of this is it's really, it's impossible for tainted cotton not to be making its way into Western shops and into shops here in the UK. Now, we don't deny that modern supply chains are very complicated, and it might be easy to terminate ties with suppliers directly in Xinjiang, but of course, raw cotton is then transferred to the core garment-producing nations of Vietnam and Cambodia and Bangladesh and elsewhere, mixed with other cotton, turned into finished products, and then shipped to places like the UK. But, and we may talk about this further, that's not an excuse, because multinational corporations are extremely powerful and well-resourced. And there's actually a growing industry around supply chain auditing, where you can even carry out isotope analysis and DNA sourcing to work out where different cotton fibers come from. But the starting point is this: UK companies are in no doubt implicated in forced labor in China. So what does the law say about it? Well, here in the UK, we've got the Modern Slavery Act 2015, and Section 54 of that requires large companies with a turnover of over 36 million to publish a modern slavery statement, setting out the steps that they'll take to prevent modern slavery. And this was groundbreaking at the time, because it was the first attempt to ensure transparency in supply chains. But it has aged quickly, and there are some serious problems with it. First of all, organizations can simply say that they've taken no steps whatsoever. The law doesn't actually require companies to do anything. And second of all, there's no monitoring of compliance. There are no sanctions for non-compliance. And so it's estimated that about 40% or so of companies that it applies to aren't complying at all. And of those that are, many see it as a tick box exercise. So the Modern Slavery Act Section 54 is without teeth, and in many ways ineffective now. And there are some steps to strengthen it, but the reality is that it's only ever going to be reporting legislation where companies say what steps they're taking. It doesn't require companies to do anything. And this is what we think the solution should be. Mandatory human rights due diligence, which requires companies to carry out due diligence of their supply chains and to identify and prevent human rights abuses in them, including modern slavery. Now, people on this call will know that due diligence is a familiar concept in the business world. And so too, the concept of human rights due diligence is not a particularly new or novel one. The idea comes from the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which are over nearly a decade old now. They were drafted in 2011. And Principle 17 of those UN Guiding Principles says that companies should in order to identify, prevent, and mitigate adverse human rights impacts, business enterprises should carry out human rights due diligence. This is a solution to the wicked problem. It would be a kind of Modern Slavery Act 2.0 that actually has teeth. And laws of this nature are being introduced now all over Europe. The best example at the moment is the French duty of vigilance law, which requires companies to prepare a vigilance plan, setting out how they'll address adverse human rights impacts, and the courts can ensure that they follow that plan. And we need a similar law of that nature here in the UK. What would that do? Also, what would the impact of a law like that be on China? and what's happening in Xinjiang? How would it apply to the Uyghur genocide? Well, there are two ways to answer that. First of all, if a law like this had been in place 5 or 6 years ago, then UK businesses could proudly have been the canaries in the coal mine and would have been the first organizations through carrying out this human rights due diligence to raise the alarm about what has happened in Xinjiang, which started back in 2016. And now it would mean that they have to take steps to mitigate those human rights abuses. And if they can't do that, then under UN Guiding Principle 19, they have to move their supply chains elsewhere. Conscious of time, so I'll draw it to a close and can maybe pick up some other points in the questions. But that's our proposed solution. And so in an event like this with people from industry, a question people will be asking, I expect, is it reasonable for large companies operating in the UK to have to do this, to have to carry out this work, and ultimately, if they can't resolve the human rights abuses they identify, to move their supply chains elsewhere? Well, that brings me back to the story I started with. Back in 1863, Abraham Lincoln actually responded to those Manchester mill workers. He sent aid ships with food for them and a letter writing directly to them, where he praised their sublime heroism, which he said has not been surpassed in any age or in any country. And what we need is that same heroism now from British workers, from British companies, and from British politicians. And it's that heroism that will help us overcome this wicked problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for getting us going, Matthew. So I'm going to now turn straight to Sir Vince Cable.
Well, thanks for asking me. Maybe I'll just start by saying where I'm coming from. I'm obviously pro-human rights, and I want Britain to be at the forefront of implementing our own human rights obligations here, and in terms of the European obligations too. And perhaps I'll just say to Matthew, I was actually one of the ministers who made sure that the Modern Slavery Act got through government in 2015. I was partly responsible for it. So I'm pro-human rights. I'm also very pro-trade. I think it's very much in our interests. I think trade with China is very much in our interests. I'm not a protectionist. I'm not in the anti-globalization movement. People like Donald Trump has done an enormous damage. So I'm pro-human rights and I'm pro-trade. So the question is about the link between the two. I'll just make a couple of general points and then go on to China. In our experience of trying to link human rights to trade is extremely unhappy. There are several recent cases of trade sanctions being employed against countries which are alleged to have human rights failures. The most recent being Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, further back. The sanctions, the trade sanctions, were totally ineffective. The government simply dug in their heels, and they hurt a lot of poor people. They achieved absolutely nothing whatever. And applying trade sanctions to China will have no effect whatever. They're a far more powerful country than the three I mentioned. And the Chinese have a fairly standard line on this. They say, this is nothing to do with the outside world. We have our sovereignty, and this is just Western colonial mentality trying to impose their values and their political system on China. And whether or not they're right, and I don't think they are, but they're going to take no notice whatever. And there's no evidence they take any notice of Western virtue signal. The second sort of general point I make is that there's very little international agreement about which human rights are appropriate when it comes to trade sanctions. I mean, the Chinese do, of course, spectacularly badly on human rights metrics, sort of Western human rights, political choice, freedom of speech, and so on. They're not quite as bad as Saudi Arabia on the Freedom House Index, but pretty bad. But on economic and social rights, they do rather better. But the problem is there's no consensus on this. I mean, what is very striking to me is that when the issue of the Uyghur Muslims has been raised as a serious case, well, Matthew calls genocide, there are quite a lot of democratic Muslim countries in the world, Indonesia, Malaysia, Pakistan, Bangladesh. Every one of them has refused to get involved in attacking China. They all say, okay, you know, there may be abuses there, but they're no worse than what's happening in India, in Kashmir, or in Palestine. So why should we get dragged into this sort of Western propaganda war, which is essentially how a lot of countries outside the G7 see it. But let me just turn very specifically to the issues which Matthew has raised. I'll be very clear, I've never been to Xinjiang. I don't claim to be an expert in it. I certainly don't speak the language. I don't speak the Chinese language. I was flatteringly referred to by Richard as a China expert. I don't claim to be a China expert, but I've taken a lot of interest in it. And Matthew uses this word genocide, and becoming increasingly common to describe China in those terms. But I'm looking at this from a common sense point of view. I'm not a lawyer. This is a strange kind of, genocide. This is not like the awful Jewish Holocaust or Rwanda or Cambodia. As far as we know, nobody's alleging that anybody's actually been killed, and that's a strange kind of genocide. Okay, there are legal definitions which stretch to cover it, maybe, but the lawyers in the American State Department at a time when Pompeo and Trump were launching this genocide allegations declined to endorse it. And quite a lot of serious people. I mean, the Economist magazine in Britain, which is very critical of Chinese human rights, refused to go along with the genocide, and they've been strongly attacked for doing it because they think there's no legal basis to it. But anyway, law is one thing, facts are another. Now, I think there's a sort of key issue also about motivation. I mean, the allegation in the West is that there is a suppression of an ethnic group. The Chinese view, and you believe it or not, is that this is the Chinese war on terror. I mean, they argue that they were subject to terrorist attacks 10 years ago, just as the West was. There is a large contingent of Uyghur Muslims who are in Islamic State and who are involved in terrorism in the Middle East, and they're cracking down. And they, the Chinese are tough. They're not a democratic country. Nobody pretends they are. And they say, well, you in the West, you had Guantanamo Bay, rendition, torture, you killed a lot of people in Iraq and Afghanistan because of the war on terror. How dare you turn around and attack us for applying our war of terror in a province of China where it is a matter of serious concern. I mean, that's their line of defense. But I think we at least need to understand where they're coming from. Now, in terms of the actual facts regarding the Uyghur genocide, I mean, I don't know, I have never been there, but I have tried to read the literature on it. And I think it's becoming increasingly clear that doubts are being raised about some of these claims. Now, really, you can believe them or not, but I think that at least they need to be heard and understood. For example, Matthew talked about millions of people in Xinjiang being detained in these camps. And nobody's quite clear where this million comes from. It was based originally on a very good academic study by a man called Adrian Zantz, who extrapolated from one particular district. But there was a key point in Zan's research, which has never subsequently been widely disseminated, when he said that people who were detained under the Chinese program were held for an average of 8 days. And I wouldn't want 8 days being indoctrinated into Xi Jinping thought or being made to pick cotton or whatever it is they do. But 8 days is a bit different from indefinite detention. The second thing, which is particularly horrific and has attracted the description of genocide, is the reference to the sterilization of women, which is awful, and particularly if it's under pressure. But there isn't anything particularly to do with the Uyghurs. I mean, it's been widely known, and indeed pro-life groups in America have been arguing this for many years, that the Chinese one-child policy is pretty tough on a lot of people. And there have been pressure from officials to have abortion and sterilization. Until recently, the Uyghurs, as an ethnic minority, were exempted, which is why the birth rate in Xinjiang is so much higher than in the rest of China, or at least it was until recently. But the program was extended to them a few years ago, and there undoubtedly have been cases, and without doubt. And it is a dreadful thing, I'm sure, to be on the receiving end. But nothing very much to do with the Uyghurs. In any event, the program has now been abandoned. As you've, I'm sure, read, the Chinese have given up on one-child policy for demographic reasons, and it's now three-child. But then we have the very specific thing about forced labor. I don't know. There is a lot of contradictory evidence about this. There are 250 million migrant workers in China. Their rights are restricted. There's a so-called hukou system, which limits, through permits, the entitlements that people have. But in terms of coercion, I mean, I've actually got the Australian report in front of me, and it's a good deal less convincing than Matthew was alleging a few minutes ago. It talks about the Chinese government facilitating the mass transfer of people. There are all kinds of qualifications that the evidence, it says, suggests. It doesn't. It's not proof. You know, we've got one report here that may or may not be true, but it's to my mind, it doesn't, not particularly convincing. And what really worries me, actually, is that the report that I'm quoting from, it just appeared on the internet today, from a group of British academics who are beginning to take apart some of this evidence, not saying it's wrong, they're just asking critical questions. And they haven't published it under their names. They published it anonymously because they've been told that if they do, they'll lose their tenure at university. There's sort of a lot of intolerance growing up around this whole debate in China from people both on the right and the left. And this is sort of worrying, lack of openness in debate. But anyway, I just put my doubts out there. I'm not saying I'm right. It may well be that the Chinese situation is every bit as bad as people claim, but there's a lot of awkward questions now being raised about the veracity of the claims which initially came from the Trump administration and have been taken up by other Western governments. Anyway, that's all I want to say about the subject. I've got sufficiently absorbed and concerned about the direction of debate about China that I'm publishing a serious book about it called The China Conundrum in September. I've got a smaller pamphlet called China Engaged that was out a few months ago. So I want to stick with this subject because I'm interested in getting to the truth rather than simply what people allege is the truth.
Thank you very much indeed, Vince. That's a great contribution. Now going to move on to Nirola Elima, who's a specialist on supply chains. Nirola, are you in Sweden?
Yes, I am. I'm in Sweden.
Great, good to see you. Over to you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Nirola Elima. Apart from I am a supply chain analyst, I'm also a Uyghur. I was born in Xinjiang and lived there for 19 years. And then I studied in China, another city in China, and worked there for around 6 years. Recently, I and my co-author, Laura Murphy, we published a report about the Uyghur forced labor and solar industry supply chain analysts. And before I do go on to this, move on to this solar report, I want to use 1 minute to talk about what happened to Uyghur people in Xinjiang. I'm quite sure most of you probably already know what's going on there, but here I want to use one of the example of my family members. My relative, my cousin, she was a Mandarin teacher to Uyghur people, and she was also an insurance saleswoman, but she was abducted to this China's re-education camp. She stayed there for around 10 months, and when she released, she was diagnosed with liver damage. And then after that, she was taken to a detention facility, and now she's serving prison time. She was one of the victims for among these 1 million Uyghur people, at least 1 million people in the concentration camp, and her destiny was ended up in the prison. And there's another part of the Uyghur people who was released from re-education camp ended up as forced labor. So today I want to focus on a question that I have been asked by a lot of people. How do you know this is forced labor, and how can you prove it? So our report was focused on the solar industry. Ever since we present for this report, we cited from the Chinese government their own document and the directives and measures. In one of their documents, they said like they state as local government officers, they went to household to make these people under their register these Uyghur people, indigenous people in their point system. And every Uyghur people, if they don't want to participate in government's poverty elevation program or surplus labor program, then their corresponding point will be conducted. So these people facing a threat for ended up in a concentration camp threat. So they have to participate in this program. And then the government will be repeatedly to change their ideological, and they will work on that and transfer these people to another province or another city far away from their home. And some of the case we have been presented in our report is people not only left behind their kids or ill parents, they also lost their land. So our report has been, since our report was focused on the solar, so I want to highlight here, in our research, we identified like 11 companies has been engaged in the forced labor transfer in Xinjiang, and 4 additional companies located with an industry park that accepted labor transfer, and 90 Chinese and international companies supply chain are affected. So first, we found out it's about the cotton industry. Now we found out the solar industry. So what is next? And what is the solution for this? I'm not a legal expertise, but as a Uyghur and as a supply chain analyst, I really hope like the government multiple government and multiple organizations can work together and make the companies to understand continually investing in Xinjiang area, it will be not only cost on million Uyghur peoples, it will destroy million people's household. And another thing, I really hope like the government can work together, and or the lawmaker will have a bill about Uyghur forced labor. Not only happen in the US, also in EU and also in UK. I really hope this atrocity in Xinjiang will be ended because as quickly as possible, but this require everyone's work here. And I really hope not every industry will start to acting or concern about until 1 or 2 scholar publish a report. I think every company, every industry should start checking on their supply chain. And this cannot be happen without the government to have a bill or have a hearing about whether the, for example, UK company has been involved in the forced labor or not. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Nirola. Thank you for that. Now we have a 4th speaker. I can't tell whether he's joined us. Is David Schilling there?
Hi, Richard. No, he isn't here.
Oh, that's a shame. That's a shame. Okay, so basically, so we've had 3 contributions. So let me just to remind you, the chat box is there. If you don't put your questions down, I'm going to ask the team questions, and they may not be the ones you want to be asked. So it's up to you. You've got to give me the questions to ask them. So please put them down in the chat box, and we'll put it to the panel. One of the things that struck me, I've just been scribbling some notes here around what's going on, and I've got things here. You know, is this about taking a stand, or is it about having an impact? And it's also about evidence. What is the evidence? Because as somebody like me, I used to work for Wilton, I used to run Wilton Park for 10 years, and a lot of our work there was around evidence which was clearly personally felt and was convincing and had conviction. But in the end, we were always trying to say, well, okay, what is the level of truth in this, and what actually is truth in these circumstances when people are immensely and quite rightly emotionally involved in what are inevitably highly emotional issues, ones where you cannot have some sort of impartial neutrality on it. You are engaged in the issue. So I think one of the things I'd like to ask all 3 panelists to start with is this question of what matters around this sort of issue. And we're using the example of China's human rights issue and trading with China. Is it about having an impact? If so, what compromises are we prepared to make in order to have impact, and what timescale are we looking at? Or is it about taking a stand more important than the impact itself? Is actually making a statement, a clear, unequivocal statement about we will not put up with this, more important than having impact, even if the process of taking a statement doesn't actually change things that much. Because it struck me, if I can go to Matthew first, the Abraham Lincoln example you gave us, Matthew, struck me very much about the cotton workers of Lancashire making a statement, possibly not knowing whether it was going to have impact or not. So I'll go to David. Go to Matthew first.
We've had countless statements from British politicians about human rights abuses all around the world, but most recently about what's happening in Xinjiang. Dominic Raab has used robust language time and time again, and he came to the Commons in January and put out a dedicated statement on the government's position. None of it's good enough because, exactly as you allude to, it doesn't have an impact. The most realistic way to have an impact, in my view, is through supply chains. I agree with Vince that problems with sanctions abound, highly political and quite possibly ineffective. And we've had a horrible episode recently with retaliatory sanctions on a number of individuals, British individuals, including even a set of barristers' chambers, where the barristers simply produced a legal opinion as to what evidence there was of genocide. So it's absolutely important that critical that whatever steps we take will have an impact, and that's why a mandatory human rights due diligence law it is going to be one of the most impactful things we could do. I wanted to come back on a few points about genocide, but I don't know whether to just pause that and do that shortly if you want to focus on this thread right now.
Yeah, I'm not going to lose that, Matthew. You're absolutely right. We will come back to this issue of genocide. But can we pause that for a minute? Vince, Vince, you were, as a government minister, a Secretary of State for Trade, at the sharp end of having to cope with these wicked decisions, where you probably have people in your office 1 minute who say you have to do this, it's hugely important, and other people 5 minutes later in your office say you can't do that because this will be damaging consequences of making this stand. how did you balance those things out? And what is it? Is it in the end about impact, or is it about making a stand?
I think actually Matthew and I agree that we're coming from opposite directions. There's an awful lot of what's happening in the West at the moment is calling out, making statements, taking a stand. It's not designed to have an impact. Well, it may be designed to have an impact, but it certainly isn't having one. And I think having an impact has to be a criteria. I mean, I was heavily involved 40 years ago in the arguments around South Africa on apartheid, and I was involved in trying to design economic sanctions when I was in the Commonwealth Secretariat, designed to undermine the apartheid government and bring it down. And that was a case where, I think one of the few cases where external action probably did have an impact. I just cannot see this happening in relation to China, because the Chinese response is to simply retaliate. You know, we've taken some economic measures because of Xinjiang and Hong Kong, and of course they simply retaliate. You know, you see what's happening in relation to Australia. So I think impact has to be a criteria. Certainly when we were thinking about South Africa, it was, you know, A, does it work? B, what impact is it going to have on the people in the country? And in this particular case, I cannot possibly see how this helps. Unfortunately, we don't have a representative movement in the way that we had with the African National Congress in South Africa to articulate the views of the people. There are exile groups, but it's not quite in the same way. I mean, there are ways in which governments can take a stand and have an impact. I mean, one of the things that outraged me when I was in government was the fact that, much more direct than picking cotton in China, was that we're selling bombs to Saudi Arabia that are being used to kill people. And they're British bombs, and we know that, and it's grossly offensive. I endeavoured to stop it when I was in government, and held it up at least. I didn't stop it. It's been continued ever since. You know, if we're wanting to have an impact, those are the kind of decisions you can target, because they're things that the British government does, which directly feed through into consequences. But in this particular case, it's not at all clear to me how these sanctions are having an impact, or, you know, why we're doing them, frankly.
Thank you, Vince. Nirola, if you're there still, could you sort of?
Yes, I am.
Well, one of the things you're obviously, Nirola, more than any of us on this call, you are personally engaged and committed, and you know, you're part of the issue in a very fundamental way. And I just wonder, if it's a choice between maximum impact or maximum taking a stand in principle, where would you prefer to go? And one of the really difficult things, I suppose, for people in your position is that compromise that has to be made with that sometimes impact takes a long time. And do you go for a short minimum impact now, or do you basically buy time for maximum impact down the line? I mean, I know it's a dreadful question, but it's a real
well, I don't think we have, as a Uyghur, we don't have the luxury to choose minimum or maximum. For my personal case, I kept when the first time took my cousin, it was in 2018, and I kept silence. I thought, maybe if I keep silence, maybe I obey, they probably will let my cousin go home. But in the end, they escalated. And I want to point it out one thing. Yes, I agree with them. We have enough statement. And to answer your question, I want to point it out one thing. Whether you just make a statement, or you make an action, or you even keep silent, you will face Chinese government retaliation. Because as long as you don't play with them, as long as you don't support them, as long as you don't contribute them, you're not their friend. in Chinese government eyes, you're not supporting my genocide action to Uyghur people. And I also wanted to point it out, when Chinese government loves to use one of the propaganda tactic is they're constantly use whataboutism. Your country in 115 years ago did this, your country did this in 100 years ago. When I heard that, for a Westerner maybe will feel like, yes, we did these horrible things in history, but as a Uyghur, when I heard that, all I heard is, why the UK government or US government can do it, why we cannot do it? Why do I need your permission to do this? Do I need a certification to do this? So as a Uyghur, for me, I don't have the luxury to choose the minimum or maximum. I want to see the law, use the justice, use the law, use the bill to prevent this genocide, prevent the genocide or stop the genocide. Because I don't think, just personally, I don't think my cousin have enough time can survive in the prison. She already diagnosed by the liver damage in the camp. I don't know what's happening to her. We heard so many testimonies saying they have been systematically raped, they have been tortured. My cousin, she didn't tell me what she has been suffered in concentration camp, but she did mention one thing to me. She asked me a question. When I asked her, how was your last 10 months in the camp? She used the one sentence to answer me. She used the question, do you remember we used to throw out the leftover in the next day if we didn't finish? But nowadays, if I drop one corner of the rice on the floor or on the desk, I will pick it up to eat it because that was a luxury thing for me for the last 10 months. So when we face the Chinese government, we should also think about it. What we would do if the time go back to the Nazi time. Now we look back, we will say we did the right things, we stopped it. But now it feels like everybody just keep quiet, or majority of people even dancing with them. So I don't have the luxury to wait for the minimum or maximum. I want to see the law. I want to see the bill. This is simply as a Uyghur people to say this.
That's hugely helpful. Thank you for describing that so eloquently, Nora. That's really helpful. I'm just going to come back to Vincent and Matthew about some of the points you made, but I just want to give a look, because I know on the call we've got somebody called, an old friend of mine called Miles Wicksteed. And Miles, if you're there, I'm going to come on to you in a minute, because I'd like you to, Miles basically ran the Commission on Africa for Tony Blair and has been a very distinguished British diplomat, but also worked very extensively on the whole Sustainable Development Goals. And I'd like Miles to talk to us a bit about a sort of a perspective from a multinational, organisation like the UN's perspective, how they deal with these wicked problems. But Vince, can I just come back to you? Something which struck me when Naira was speaking is that genocide is a very specific term. It has a legal term, but in the end, at a very human level, it is simply the sum of individual tragedy and individual crimes. And I wonder, when you were a government minister, how you managed that, because presumably the pressure on you was to deal with the big stuff, as in multiple events rather than single events. But every tragedy, like Nairobi was speaking, it doesn't matter whether it's 1 or 20 million. Each one of those 20 million is an individual one, and it matters. And I wonder how, at what point does genocide matter if just one thing happens?
Well, I mean, the testimony we've heard this evening is very, very moving, and obviously is authentic. And there are many people who have suffered. I don't doubt that for a moment. My experience as a politician, I was an MP for 20 years, is my Friday evening advice surgery with refugees with stories of their own experience, which are also horrifying. Kurds, Palestinians, Kashmiris, people from Indonesia, and many countries in Africa, all of which, are comparable. I mean, sometimes worse, sometimes better. And they're all very moving. But the question is, how do you establish some kind of hierarchy of punishment for the regimes? How do you, decide which are the worst, and how do you isolate them? And that's where we come to the issue of genocide. And I really think that this is a terrible misuse of the language. I mean, I was very much involved in the whole Holocaust memorial exercises and trying to promote it in schools. And the whole point about it was that, you know, whole people were being killed in large numbers. And what's happened in Rwanda happened in Cambodia. If we're just simply going to say that genocide is every case of a significant number of individuals or minorities losing their human rights, I mean, it just makes the word meaningless. And we're now getting a case in Brazil where the official opposition in Brazil wants to have Bolsonaro arraigned before international courts on genocide grounds, because a lot of people have died in the pandemic. So it's now becoming a kind of cheap use of language. You know, you can apply it in so many cases. I mean, there must be 50 countries in the world which meet some of the criteria of genocide. It's just debasing the concept.
Thank you, Vince. I'm going to come to Matthew. Matthew.
Yeah, I strongly disagree with that. And let me tell you why. The word genocide is a modern word. It was made up by a Polish Jewish lawyer called Raphael Lemkin after World War II to describe what happened to the Jewish people in World War II. But it's not a we use the word genocide like it can be used in ordinary language, but it only has a legal meaning. And that legal meaning is set out in the Genocide Convention. And the Genocide Convention sets out 5 prohibited acts, which, when those prohibited acts are combined with an intention to destroy a people, that amounts to genocide. It's a narrow, prescribed legal definition, and the word was invented for this sole purpose, right? Now, some of those 5 acts are what Vince refers to: killing, torture, those things. But those are only 2 of the 5. The others include preventing births, forcibly removing children, and then the 5th one is a catch-all, which is to deliberately inflicting on a group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. So first of all, there is some evidence of killing and torture, whether it's in the form of rape or forced labor or otherwise. There's also evidence of forced sterilization and the removal of children from their families. And everything together in the sum, as you refer to, Richard, I have no doubt amounts to conditions of life calculated to physically destroy a people in whole or in part. So I think those 5 acts are all being carried out to varying degrees, but they have to be combined with an intention to destroy a people. But there is evidence of that. There were some leaked documents from China's state media, which expressly said that the goal of all of this was to, and I quote, break their lineage, break their roots, break their connections, and break their origins. So look, from the perspective of a human rights advocate, not necessarily a lawyer, it seems to me there is strong evidence of genocide according to the the Genocide Convention, the legal definition within the Genocide Convention. But I do agree, more widely, there is an evidential problem here. And of course there's going to be. We're talking about a incredibly authoritarian state with powerful state apparatus to control information within and without the country. But there has been that being the case, it is for courts to determine whether a genocide is taking place. And I was part of efforts earlier on this year to try to come up with a mechanism to allow British courts to determine or make preliminary determinations on whether a genocide is occurring in Xinjiang. Why did we try to get British courts to do this? Because the international system isn't working, because the International Court of Justice has no jurisdiction, and China can veto any resolution by the UN to the International Criminal Court. So there's going to be no international court that can come up with a preliminary determination on whether what's happening amounts to a genocide. So we came up with an ingenious solution to sort of give the power to British courts to do that. And there were amendments to the trade bill earlier on this year to try to create that mechanism, but it was killed by the Tory government. And that's why recently people hopefully will have seen that there is an ad hoc tribunal in the UK called the Uyghur Tribunal, run by one of our most preeminent lawyers, Geoffrey Nice QC, which just a few weeks ago was hearing evidence and first-hand testimony in its first set of hearings, and is going to be making a ruling in due course as to whether there's evidence of genocide. And a final point too, and Vince will be aware of this, there was also a legal opinion by those barristers at Essex Court Chambers, where they looked at all of the publicly available information and came to the reasoned conclusion that there was credible evidence of a genocide according to the legal definition. You know, there's an evidential problem, but as far as there's evidence available, it is only pointing in one direction. And I don't agree at all that it's a misuse of the language or debases the language. It doesn't. It's true to the original drafting of the Genocide Convention by Raphael Lemkin.
Can I move on? There's a very interesting question by Ajinur S in the Q&A, which is addressed to Vince, but it's a very long question. It's a very interesting statement, and I urge you all to read it. One of the things I'd like to look at is this business of when you suspect something's happening, you go and investigate it. And the problem is, how do you investigate it? And one can always get very powerful testimonies, you can have ad hoc processes, but in the end, it's if you like, it's processes which have been determined and set up through law and through good practice that provides evidence of if an event has occurred, and if an event has occurred, to provide irrefutable proof that has happened. So I'm going to ask Vince, but I'm also going to ask Miles, and I think Vince knows Miles quite well anyway. Miles, are you there?
I am here, Richard, yes.
Brilliant. Miles, you've been a close observer of the UN for a number of different reasons, and I think what came up in Ajinur's questions, that there should be an investigation, but what Ajinur said is that basically the Chinese do not allow such an investigation to happen. What occurs in an organization like the UN when one of its members, if you like, prevents a process which conceivably could put them in the clear? What happens in that world? What is our recourse if the process of legitimate law investigation based on law is not allowed to proceed?
Well, the answer to that, Richard, is that there's very little recourse, especially when the country in question is a member of the Security Council, because members of the Security Council are able to block almost anything happening. We have seen investigations into a whole host of things fail because we haven't had that unanimity in the Security Council, which is required. So it is, as you described it at the beginning, a wicked problem. And you mentioned before Africa, etc. So let me just say, spend a minute, if I may, just saying a little bit about that. When we did the Commission for Africa work back in 2004, 2005, China clearly was playing a major role in Africa and has continued to play that major role. It didn't question African leaders, particularly on their human rights records, and they were very happy to support Chinese business invested in their economies. That's beginning to bite back just a little bit now, because some of those soft loans that China made, African governments are now finding quite difficult to repay some of that money. And what that is effectively doing is that is giving a Chinese hold over, for example, various ports in East and Southern Africa, which is giving the Chinese a bit of a stranglehold on some of these economies. So the relationship is not quite such a friendly and positive one, I think, as it was. I mean, it was very noticeable, you know, when I was an ambassador in Africa, that, you know, the US would invite heads of African state to Washington. Far more went to Beijing when they were invited by the Chinese. One final point, you mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals when you said you were going to pounce or launch a question onto me. The truth is, and this is why it's a wicked question, if we are going to crack some of the key problems facing the world, in particularly issues around climate change, environmental sustainability, we absolutely have to have the Chinese on board. We cannot address those issues successfully without their participation. So we do have to have a very nuanced approach. We should be speaking out against what we see as abuses, but at the same time, we need to find ways of working with the Chinese and other countries whose values we don't necessarily share. And there is a huge amount of discussion going on about that at the moment, not least because at least, you know, at last we have a US president and a US which is ready to re-engage internationally and put some power back into the multilateral system. So I'm afraid I haven't added much to solutions on this, simply to agree this is a wicked problem and we have to find ways of engaging at the same time as being critical. Thanks for asking me to speak.
Thank you very much, Miles. I'm going to come to all my panelists now and just ask them for a few final comments, but I'm going to ask them each of them an individual question, but that doesn't restrict what they can say to end up. So if I could go to Vince first. Vince is still there. I'm just waiting for Shahama to remove Miles's face from our screens and put Vince's back. No, we're going to continue. Oh, there he is. Great. There's only, Vince, you'll know, there's only so much time you look at Miles Wicksteed, frankly. Vince, you were a minister, and you know we always think about ministers being in a position of power and making decisions, but in the end, you are coping with contradictory information. You know, whatever decision you make, there's a downside to it as well as a plus side. So in a position as we have, say, with China now, where there are accusations and to a degree enough prima facie evidence coming out from personal testaments, such as from Nirola and the stuff that Matthew's talking about, to say there should be an investigation of this, but the Chinese government will, frankly, is not allowing an investigation. What, putting yourself back to being a cabinet member of the UK government, how do you approach that?
Well, my view, of course, the situation has changed since I was there. President Xi is clearly moving in a more authoritarian direction than was apparent 5 years ago. But my approach to China was not based on judgment whether they're good or bad. I mean, I'm not a communist and I'm not in favor of authoritarian government, but I took the view that it was very much in our interest to engage with China. Primarily, partly for British national interest, but primarily because of what somebody's called international public goods. I mean, there's a whole lot of issues. Climate is probably top of the list. Nuclear proliferation, getting rules on international trade. A whole set of things. Helping get some common rules on debt in Africa, which Miles has just talked about. And all these problems actually require Chinese participation. And we have some evidence that if approached in the right way, the Chinese can be quite constructive in dealing with these things. Time will tell if that's wishful thinking. So my overriding concern would be to ensure that we engage with China constructively, because of self-interest and because of the wider global interest. I note all kind of accusations of human rights abuse in China. I actually raised human rights issues with Chinese party secretaries, top people now in the Politburo. And what I found was if you raise it publicly, they take this as an insult and they're very obstreperous. If you raise it privately, they will engage you in an intelligent conversation and try and argue back. As it happened, and Matthew may be interested in this, I mean, I always raised labour rights issues because that was part of my ministerial portfolio. And had long discussions about why a so-called socialist country has less protection for labour than the wicked capitalist West, and finished up sending pamphlets explaining how we apply laws on minimum wages and things of this kind. So there is that kind of relationship. But on the, I'm afraid we're just going to have to agree to disagree on the issue of Xinjiang. I mean, Matthews uses this very powerful phrase, they're trying to destroy a people, and he quotes one Chinese bureaucrat to that effect. I mean, there's mountains of quotations from Chinese officials, some of which are in favor of assimilating their ethnic minorities, getting them to speak Chinese, Mandarin. Others are in favor of a kind of Western-style cultural diversity. That argument has sort of rather receded. But the argument that they're trying to destroy a people, I mean, is not just, you know, very loaded, but I've really found the evidence that I've seen utterly unpersuasive.
Thank you very much indeed, Vince. Narola, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Hi. Narola, first of all, you know, I'd just like to say thank you very much for your personal testimony. I realise how much that takes and costs you to do that. But it is very powerful, and it's not just emotionally powerful, but it makes a situation real. It's not an academic discussion, it's a real situation about real people. How do you, obviously I'd like your final thoughts, but in doing that, could you just tell us how you think things should proceed now in the real world? You know, what is realistically possible? And in that context of what is realistically possible, how would you like to see things proceed for your cousin, your family, and your people?
Since today we're talking about forced labor, so on the company level, I hope I'm calling on all this investment firm stop investing on a region. Let's say has an ongoing genocide, or as some conservative will think is a crime against human rights. I don't think it's moral to continue to invest on this kind of region when there's terrible things happening. And not only that, I think the company should pull out from Xinjiang. And I know it's in short term it will cost a lot, or make company will feel like extremely pain when it's come to losing money. But if we think about on long term, this is not only benefit for the Uyghur people, also actually benefit for the Western people or another developing country. So they will have a more chance to develop their economy without destroying people in life. And on the government level, like I said before, I hope the government or lawmakers, they will actually consider about having a strong law toward to the Uyghur people. And for the individual consumer custom, when they're purchasing stuff, I really hope people start to also demanding for the company to have a transparency on their supply chain. Because for my personally, I haven't purchased any the clothes for the last 2 years, because every time when I go to a shop, I don't dare to buy it. I don't know where the cotton is coming from. And so I really hope things can change by everyone devoted on this. And for my cousin things, I hope my cousin thinks this is just individual. This is not just individual case. She's just one person among this 1 million. And I wish everyone talk about my cousin things, but it won't enough. There's a lot of people who doesn't even have a chance, have a family to speak of that. For example, my friend Nurisman, her entire family is gone. Her entire family, mother, father, 2 brothers, all of them gone. Who speak for them? My best friends from my childhood, her mother-in-law died in a concentration camp. I cannot even speak for her because she doesn't dare to she won't want me. She said China will have the retaliation toward my another friend, another family member. And my father's friend, an uncle who has, I went to their home to eat food. I hang out with their kid. He died after 6 days released from the camp. I cannot speak for him. My family case is just only one tip of this iceberg. Imagine so many people, they don't have a chance to speak up. So for me, I hope there will be a lot of people like Matthew can, work really hard on this and use the law to protect us. Because this genocide things, it's not only gonna stop in Uyghur. What about next time happening in another country? Are you guys gonna sit in there waiting for another law to make for them? We should have a uniform law, like a really strong law, not only benefit for Uyghur people, also prevent future forced labor or future genocide. Thank you.
Nirala, thank you very much indeed. Very, very powerful, and I think all of us are grateful to you for making that. You're a very powerful advocate. Matthew, you've got a couple of minutes just to throw a bit of light on this and step.
Yeah. No, I'll be very quick because I think that's a much more powerful ending than I could possibly offer. But safe to say, look, history will judge us now. History looks back on those Manchester mill workers and looks on them kindly for what they did. And we have to stand up and take action now. I agree with Vince that British arms manufacturers shouldn't be making bombs to be sold to Saudi Arabia, but I also believe British textiles companies shouldn't be benefiting from forced labor. And whether or not what is happening amounts to a genocide, we can agree to disagree. But I think we must agree that whatever you say, they're grave human rights abuses. And look, I'm offering a solution. The solution is a Modern Slavery Act 2.0, which imposes obligations on companies to carry out mandatory human rights due diligence. And this would, as you've said, Richard, this would have an impact. It would do much more than just virtue signaling, because it would prevent British companies from facilitating what's happening and benefiting from it, and stop putting British consumers in a position where we too are benefiting from it every time we go into a shop and buy clothes that are affected by this tainted cotton. That's all I have to say. We have to take action now because history will judge us if we don't.
Thank you very much indeed. Everyone, thank you very much indeed for joining us for this discussion. I think the nature of these discussions, as George Bush, the vicar of St Mary in Bow, would tell us, is that the important thing is to keep talking, because the solutions, the problems may be wicked, the solution's hard, but rest assured they're not going to get any less wicked or solutions easier to find if we do not talk and debate and engage on these issues. So thank you all for participating in this. I'm really grateful to Nirala, to Matthew, and to Sir Vince for being on our panel this evening. It was really kind. I'm very grateful to Miles for stepping in at the last minute. Miles is used to this, I do pick on him. And also to Anjana for using the chat to such great effect. So finally, big thank you from me to all of you for attending, and to St Mary Le Bow and the Just Share movement, and particularly to Shahana for keeping us all in order, and she'll now see us on our way. Good night, everyone, and thank you for joining us.